Hi there. In the previous video, I updated my ChatWTF ChatGPT clone project to use a database instead of sessions to store the conversation history, so that it will persist even if I close the browser. But I really like the old version because you were able to just clone the repository, add your API key, and then it just works. So in today's video, I would like to add as an option session storage for the message. Now, what we could do is we could just go in here into our message.php, and in every place where we get the messages or we add a message, we could just add an if statement. If we want to use sessions, we do it this way, otherwise we do it the other way. But that would be stupid, so we are not going to do that. So instead, what we are going to do is we are going to implement a conversation class, and we are going to make one for the session storage and one for the SQL storage. So let's do that. So currently I have all my database functions in this database.php. So we can check if a chat exists, we can get the chats, we can get the messages, and we can add a message. Now, by the way, I fixed from the previous version this chat exists because I was using here row count to check if we actually have the specific conversation in the database. But apparently this does not work with SQLite, so I had to change it to fetch column. Now, there might be a better way of doing this actually. We should probably be using count star or something to just get the number of the results or something. I'm not quite sure what is the actual correct way of doing this. You can let me know in the comments. But anyway, let's now move all of these functions into a class. So chat exists, get chats, get messages, add message, create conversation, set conversation title, and delete chat. These are all part of the conversation. So we are going to create a conversation class. So I will create a new folder here called src, and I will create a new file here called conversation.php. And in fact, I will make this SQLConversation.php. And then here I am going to create a class SQLConversation. And I will paste all these functions in here. And now we are passing the database to all of these functions, but we don't want to do that because we are using a class. So I will create a constructor for this class. And we will pass in the database here. And I will make it protected database so that it will actually be saved as a property of this object. So then we can remove all of these things. And instead, we can call this database. So now we only have to pass it once when we initialize the SQL conversation. I'm sorry, this should be this database. And in fact, we don't want to pass in the chat ID in each of these because a conversation will have only one ID. So let's create a function called find, and we will pass in here the chat ID. And then we will set this chat ID to the chat ID. And let's add that here as a property. And let's call it protected integer chat ID. And in this find function, we should do the following. In fact, we should get the chats. And I still have the PDO database here, so I don't need that one. So we could, in fact, call here this get chats. And in fact, this get chats function does not belong in here because this will get all the conversations. So I will move it away from here for now. Now, of course, we should return an array of those conversations from this. So what our find function should do is it should actually do this chat exists. But instead of doing just fetch column of the ID and returning a Boolean, it should actually get the ID and the title. So let's do that. Let's move this in here and let's select everything from conversations. And we can delete this chat exists function. And we could return Boolean from this. So we either return true if we found the chat or false if we didn't find the chat. And if we found the chat, then we will actually update this SQL conversation to have the information of the chat. So we will do this. If statement row count. Now, I guess I can't use row count. What should I use then? Because SQLite doesn't work like this. So I'll just do this. Data equals statement fetch PDO fetch ASOC. So this should work in both SQL and SQLite. And I believe that fetch will return Boolean or null if it is not found. So it will return false on failure, but is failure when it is not found? I'm not quite sure. We will find out. So I'll say if not data. I can in fact do just this. If not data, then return false. And otherwise, we will set the chat ID to the chat ID, and we will set this data to the data. And we will define that here. So this will be the data of this conversation. So the ID and the title. So let's set protected array data. So then what should we do next? We should return true in this case. So we found it. And get messages. Again, we don't have to pass in the chat ID because now we should have it in this chat ID. And here as well, we don't have to pass in chat ID because we have it. So we will say this chat ID. And this should work just fine. We don't have to make any modifications to this. And add message should work just fine. We don't need to modify anything. And create conversation. Now, what should this be? This should kind of be in the constructor. So then we can call new SQL conversation, and then it will be created. But you don't necessarily want to do that. And in that case, we should change our find function into a static function, because we can, of course, find if we use the constructor to create it, and then we find, then we have an empty conversation already. So perhaps I will just make a save function. So let's do that. Let's call it save. And I will not pass in the title. I will create a function for that. So I'll say function set title, which will take the title. And it will just say this title, or in fact this data title equals title. And what save will do is it will save it into the conversations. So let's say this title. And now here what we have to do is we have to say if this chat ID is null. That means we are going to create a new one. So we will move that in there. And sorry, this is not title, this is data title. And otherwise, if we have a chat ID, then that means we have to save it. So we are going to do basically this, set conversation title. We can remove this one completely, and instead we are going to do it here. So we will update the title to this data title, where the chat ID is this chat ID. And in this case, we will return last insert ID, and in this case, we can just return this chat ID. So now we can save, which also will create if we don't have it yet. And we have a delete chat, and I will just call this delete, because this is already a chat or conversation. And we don't have to pass in a chat ID. We will just say this chat ID, and that should work. And in fact, we might make this get chats like a static function. So we might put it in here, and let's make it a static function. Or it doesn't need to be static since we are not doing anything in the constructor. Then, okay, I will make it static because I like the way it looks when it's just SQL conversation get chats. And I will make the find function static as well, so we can say find. Now, of course, we have to then pass in our database into both of these, which is not that nice, but let's do it anyway. Let's say PDO database, and let's do it here as well. Find chat ID and PDO database. And then we will just say database here. And then, of course, we will call these static. And I forgot to put public to every one of these. Now, in fact, you don't need to put public because they are automatically public, but I will do it anyway because that is how it is usually done. And it's better to tell that this is a public function so that there's no question whether it should be public or private. So that should work. but we have to say, sorry, we can't return Boolean from this anymore. We have to return an actual SQL conversation. So this will return, I can say static, I guess, or self. And then we can create a new SQL conversation. So we will say conversation equals new SQL conversation, and we will pass in the database, and we will set the data. So let's do conversation set data to the data. And let's create this set data function, and we will return then conversation. So let's do public function set data, and we'll pass in the array data. Now, perhaps this is a little bit complicated, but it's going to work. We can always refactor later. And this will just say this data equals data. So now the find function should return a new SQL conversation with the data already inserted. Now the data will have the ID already, so I'm not sure if I have to have the chat ID separately. Perhaps it is good because this is kind of weird if we have just data, we don't know what is in there. So we might in fact do this. Since we have just two things, we have the ID and the title, so I will just set title and ID and no data. And then what we will do is we will set ID to data ID, and we will set title to data title. So now we don't have to have this weird data array that we don't know the contents of. So let's do that. And our set title function will now be just this title equals title. And let's do set ID. And I call it chat ID, so let's call it chat ID. And do we have data somewhere else? Here, so this will be just this title. Okay, that should now work. Did I implement everything already? Add message. This will be the array with the role and the content and this chat ID. Okay, let's see if this works. So now in our message.php, oh, sorry, I still have to implement that get chats because this needs to return an array of SQL conversations. So let's do this. Let's say that chats equals that. And then let's do for each of the chats as chat, we are going to say that the conversation equals new SQL conversation with the database and conversation set ID to the chat. Well, in fact, we could just now, so we could use the find function, but what that will do is it will create a new SQL query for each of the conversations. But we already have that information here. So probably it would be better just to do it this way. So we will do the same thing as we do here. So actually I will copy this and paste it here, and let's call this data. So now we are constructing the SQL conversations from the conversations in the database, and we do only one SQL query here. And then we will return some list, and let's set the list here to an empty list, and then let's do list append conversation. So now we should return an array of conversations, and I'll in fact call this self, just so that we don't have to replace it when we create the session version of this. So now we are not mentioning, we are mentioning it here. I will say self here as well, and this should be done now. Let's see if it works. So now in our message.php, we have to make some changes. So we have to do this. Conversation equals SQL conversation find, and we are going to find the chat ID, and we'll pass in the database. And we have to require our SQL conversation. So let's do src SQL conversation. And then we have to do this. We are checking here if the chat exists. So what we will just do is if not conversation, because this will return false, right? If it doesn't exist. Yes. So actually I have to put here false, self or false. So if we don't have the conversation, we will create a new conversation. So we are going to say that conversation equals new SQL conversation, and we'll pass in the database. Now I have to set that default ID. I guess I could do it here. We could just say conversation set title untitled chat. And then the context will be conversation get messages. And this will return just the same array type like this. So we have a role and the content. And then here where we call add message, we will just say conversation add message. And we don't have to pass these in there, only the message. And we will do the same thing here. So conversation add message. And we don't need these ones. And what else do we have here as well? Conversation add message. And none of this stuff. And then we have to update our index.php. So let's first require src/SQLConversation. And let's do the same thing here. So let's say that the conversation equals SQLConversation find. And we pass in the chat ID. And I'll just make this int val. And then I will pass in the database. And then I'll say if conversation, if not conversation, then chat ID is 0. Yeah, this was something weird because if we set a conversation ID that doesn't exist, then that ID will be sent with the request and that causes some problems. Now, I don't like this kind of thing here. We can fix it later, but for now, let's just leave it as it is. And then we can go down here and get chats. So this will just do SQLConversation get chats. And we pass in the database. And that should return the chats as SQL conversations. So now we have to change that behavior. So the ID will be actually chat get ID. And we have to create this. I think I didn't create that yet. And this will be get title, which I will also have to do. And here we will have get messages. So this will be conversation get messages. And again, this actually returns an array. So that is fine. And we don't have a message type. So it's just a regular associative array with the role and the content. So that should work if we create these two functions, get ID and get title. Now we don't get any errors here because we have not type hinted what conversation find returns, or sorry, what get chat returns. But we can fix that by adding a dot block here. So we will say return array of SQL conversation. Actually, we can say self, I believe. So now if we go back to our index, then we have errors here because we don't have get ID or get title. Because now the IDE knows that, okay, chats is an array of SQL conversations. So let's go to SQL conversation and let's add those functions here. So we need get ID and get title. So let's call these get, and we don't pass in anything. We just return these. So now everything should work. As you can see, our index.php does not have any errors anymore, and now it should work. So let's see if this thing still works. So if I go back here and I refresh, then it actually still has this customer service assistant, not as. If I click this, it still opens. And did I really do it first try? What if I say, that's funny? By the way, you have to appreciate the joke that it gave me previously. Why did the SQLite database go to therapy? Because it had trouble with relationships. It could never commit. And we got an answer back. And if I refresh, then it is still here. And if we create a new chat, and one thing we have to fix is the title generation. I did not fix that one. So if we open this, we probably have some red files here. We don't have red files. Why don't we have red files? Okay, we do have a problem here. So we have a set conversation title. So what we have to do instead is we have to say conversation equals SQL conversation find, and we are going to find the chat ID, and we have to pass in the database. And then we can say if conversation, so if we have that conversation, then we are going to set its title. And we are going to do this by saying conversation set title. And we can remove these, and we can just call conversation save. And then we can echo the title. And otherwise, we can like throw an exception or something. Throw new exception, unable to create title. Now, I believe that I am not handling any errors when I get the title, so we will probably get like an error message as the title. So we have to fix that later. But this should now work. And our delete function we have to fix as well. And we have to, of course, require our thing here. So we have to say src/SQLConversation. And let's do that over here as well. And we are going to say again the same thing. I'll copy it from here. So we will do that, but we will instead say delete. And that should work. And I will echo deleted. And I guess else I can echo error. Now again, I think we are not handling any errors here, but we can do that later. So now everything should work. If I refresh this and I create a new chat and I say, what's your name? We get an error. Okay, so in a new conversation, we have an error. What is the error? Chat ID must not be accessed before initialization. Okay, so that means we are trying to get messages before we have a chat ID. So I think that this fetch will return an empty array, which is not nothing. So we will not go to this even if we can't find it. So I have to say, if not data or empty, we can actually do just empty. If data is empty, then return false, because empty will handle null and false and everything, and an empty array. So let's see if that will work. What's your name? It still doesn't work. So what is going on? So in line 23, we get the messages from the conversation. Okay, so I just have to add, if we don't have chat ID, this chat ID, then we will just return an empty array. So let's try this. What's your name? Empty is too short, okay? What happened now? We got another error. Unable to create title. Okay. And do we have another one? That's the old one. Or is it? No, this is a different line. Add message. Okay, so we have to create the chat here. So let's do this. Let's save the conversation somewhere. Now I could just save it here, that if we don't have the conversation, then we create it and we save it. But in case there's an error, we get an empty conversation. I guess it doesn't matter. So I might add it down here, but then I have to add it also here because we're adding the system message. So I'll just put it here. Conversation save. And then we should have an ID. Let's make sure that we are actually setting the ID. We are not setting the ID, so I will say this chat ID equals last insert ID, and then I can just return from both of these the chat ID. So now it should work. So if I create a new chat and I say, what's your name? We get an error still. What am I doing wrong now? Chat ID must not be accessed. Save. So, okay, I am checking if it is null. I have to say if it is not set, because I'm not setting it to null to begin with. It is not set. So here we initialize it with nothing. So now 5th times the charm. So let's do what's your name? And 5th time is not the charm. Undefined array key chat ID. Okay, I have to set it to 0 here. That's not related to this problem. So we are not getting the messages. So we got this error from the title because we did not save the conversation. So then we were unable to create the title because we don't have that conversation. But let's see what is the issue here. I will change to my MySQL database because the SQLite, I cannot see what is going on. So I will refresh this and I will say hello. And I will check my messages here. So we got hello and we got a conversation. No, we didn't get a conversation. We just get the message. Okay. So our conversation save is not working. So this is not working. Let's do error log saving. And let's do here error log creating. And in fact, I can move this here. So we will either get saving or creating when we send a new message. So we know what is it doing. Hello. And let's check creating. Okay. So we are going to that query, but we are not saving it. So if I go to conversations, in fact, I think we added here 10 and 11. But we don't have any messages for number 11 conversation. Why is that? Let's go to our message and we are printing the chat ID. Okay, this is the problem. We have to echo actually the conversation get ID because the chat ID is what we pass in here. So we pass the previous chat's ID into this one, or we're passing 0 or whatever. But now we are returning the actual new ID of the created conversation. So let's see if that works. Hello. Hello, how can I assist you today? So now it actually works. And let's see if we can delete these old ones. So I will delete all of these and let's see if they are actually deleted. Yes, they are deleted. And if I open this, we still have the messages here. And if I say, tell a joke, it will tell me a joke. Why don't scientists trust atoms? Because they make up everything. It always tells this joke. So I believe that now it is working. So we are actually saving it in the database. And we are doing exactly what we did before, but now we have to implement those sessions. So first I will make sure that this is still working with the SQLite as well. So change the settings to SQLite and I will refresh. And if I go here, we have this message here and I can delete that one and it will be deleted. And if I say, tell a MySQL joke, it will say, why did the developer go broke? Because he lost all his tables in a bad SQL transaction. That is not a joke, that is a horror story. And it didn't quite work because we didn't get the title. So why is that? We didn't get any errors. Actually, we didn't post to create title. So let me remove my error log at first. We don't need this here anymore. And I think the new logic is in the index. So this is the problem. So I think that we are not setting the new chat because down here we are setting it to this global JavaScript variable. And then based on this, we will decide in script.js whether to create a new title or not. So here, somewhere, title, create title. Okay. Now wait a minute. We did create a title because it added this thing in here. Did we create an empty title? Conversations. I can't see it now. I mean, yes, we created an empty title because, no, wait a minute. This is stuck now. I think this is because I'm using the PHP built-in server and there's like, it's still sending, okay, I think it's still sending the create title message because the PHP built-in server cannot handle concurrent connections. So it's now actually stuck. So I think it's still, it works. It's just a problem of PHP's built-in server. So if we were actually using like Apache or something, then it would work. So if we go here and we create a new one and we say, what's up? It will do it and it will create a title. Okay, so it works. It's just a problem with the PHP built-in server. So now let's implement session storage. So how I want to do this is I am going to copy my SQLConversation class and I will create a new class called SessionConversation. So we will in fact not do any modifications to the other code. We are only going to change this. And then of course we are going to change from SQL conversation to session conversation everywhere where we call new SQL conversation. So let's do that. So if we want to use sessions, what should we do? First of all, this will be called SessionConversation. And the constructor will not take a PDO object. We might do something like if session status is not session, what is it called? Started, session active, PHP session active. Then we are going to session start. And get chats. What will this do? We are not going to pass in PDO again. We are just going to do this. Chats equals session chats and this chat ID. And I will set this to an empty array if we don't have it. And what is the problem here? Sorry, we cannot have this get chats of the chat. Okay, so we just pass in the chat ID. Sorry, this is only the chats. So we just get the chats from the session because these are all the conversations. And then we are going to loop through all the conversations and we are going to get the ID and the title. So exactly this. And then when we find a chat, we don't pass in the PDO and we do this. Data equals session chats and the chat ID or an empty array. And again, we do that. And then when we get the messages, then we do that if we don't have the chat ID. Otherwise, we just return session chats chat ID or an empty array. And we can remove all this. And this should be this chat ID. And add message will not do any of this. It will only say session chats this chat ID, append a message, which will have actually just the message, message, and return true. And set ID does that, set title does that, and everything. And save will actually do the same thing in both cases. So we will just do, in fact, not quite. So if we don't have a chat ID, then we have to create a chat ID. So let's do this chat ID equals unique ID. Now, did I in fact use integer for this? I did, so I can't use unique ID. But I guess we can just do count session chats. So that will be the ID. And then we can say session chats, and we will add into it this chat, which will have an ID, which will be this chat ID, and it will have a title, which will be this title, and it will have messages, which will be an empty array at this point. And if we are saving it, then we are going to do the same thing, but we will pass in this chat ID, and we're going to set the ID and the title, and the messages will be this get messages. But this will return an array, exactly. So this is just an array of the row and the content. And then we return the chat ID. So exactly this. But I think I have to do something. So we have to actually say messages. So we will add the messages to the chat ID messages key. And I guess we have to create the element in the chats first, or we get a warning. But let's see what warning we get. So we will do this. And then delete. What does delete do? Delete will just say session chats this chat ID unset. We will unset this. So that should work now. But I think this will give us a warning in the latest versions of PHP. So we are going to test it out and see what warning we get. So now when we are using SQLConversation, then I will in fact require both of them. I will require SessionConversation and SQLConversation in each of these files. And I will change all of the SQL conversations into session conversations. So now we should be using sessions instead of SQL. let's see if it works. If I refresh this, we get nothing, of course, because we don't have anything in the sessions. And if I say hello, I get an error. So let's see what is the error. Okay, we get this error. Count needs a countable or array. So we have to say that if we don't have the chats yet, then we will just do an empty array, although we could initialize it up here. So we will do here, if empty session chats, then session chats is an array. So let's try this again. New chat, hello. And we have another error, so let's see what it is. Cannot access offset of type string on string. So what does this do? Send ChatGPT message. So messages will be now an array of strings apparently, but it should be an array of arrays. So let's do send ChatGPT message. We are doing it here. So context will be an array of strings now, okay? So what does get messages do? It just gets the chats from this chat ID or an empty array, okay? And add message adds a message. So wait a minute. When we call add message, we in fact add the whole array there. So it should work. Let me do some debugging again. So if I create a new file here, and I do here session start, and I do print r session, and I add here pre, then we should be able to see that if we go to /debug.php, so what we have here, chats, 0, ID, title, messages, and we have an array of messages. So I'm not sure what the problem is. So let's go back and see this error again. Cannot access offset of type string on string, which is this. So it means this is a string. Why is that a string? Let's do here error log print r messages. And let's see what this actually is. So I'll go back here and I will say hello. And let's see what we have in here. Okay, we have ID, title. Okay, so this is actually the conversation, not the messages. So when we get, when we get the messages, get messages, we have to get the messages key here. So now it should work. So if we go back here and we refresh and we say hello, then now we get a different error, but at least it's progressed. And I think that the problem is that when we get the messages, we are actually getting them. So let's see now our debug.php. Title is the power of lengthy messages in effective communication. And we have a message here. So this is fine. It does it perfectly, but get messages returns something unexpected. Do we not have the chat ID? Chat ID messages. So here we are passing in the context, which will be the context from get messages. So here we are adding the message to the messages, and then it should be here because we do two requests. So the first request, we will add the message, and then the next one will go here and it will get the event stream of the ChatGPT API. So it must mean that our get messages does not work. So let's in fact do again error log and print r context. And let's see what happens. Hello. Okay, it is too short. And okay, it is empty. So the problem is we are not starting the session. So it is not enough that I have it here. So I'll in fact remove this. And I will put it in the message.php. Or should I add it in the find? Maybe I should do that. So I will add it here. I will in fact make a function here called this init session. And this will be a private function or a protected function, init session. And it will do this. And we will also call it in our static functions. So this has to be static as well. Static. So we will say self init session. And here we will do the same thing. And here as well. So now we should have the session all the time when we are using it. And actually now we can get the list of all our chats here. So if we now say hello, then it says, hello, how can I assist you? And we get a title. So now it's working. And if I refresh and I go back here, we don't get the chats because the ID is 0 for some reason. How about these other ones? We have some hellos here. So let's see if we can delete these. If I delete that one and I refresh, okay, we can delete them. So let me delete everything and let's start over. So let's check our debug now. We should have nothing. Okay, we have just chats, which is an empty array. So if we now, let's go directly to this page. And if I say hello, we get the message and we get an ID. And if we refresh, it is still there. And if we open it, we don't get it because the chat ID is 0. So if we open this debug, ID is 0. Okay. Where are we setting the ID? We are setting the ID of the count of the chats, but we have not saved it at this point. So let's move it down here. Because if the ID is 0, then our logic says that, okay, we didn't get the ID. So let's do that. And let's refresh and delete that. And let's try again. Hello. And sorry, what am I doing here? We cannot set it afterwards. So I will just do +1. And I will try this again. Hello. And I still get an error. Do I have some wrong data in here now? Yes, because we didn't set any of the ID and title here. So I will have to delete everything from there. So let's do here session equals nothing, empty array. And let's refresh. So now we don't have anything in there. And let's go back and let's try it again. Tell me a joke. And what is the error now? Uncaught type error. Session conversation set ID must be string null given. Chat ID or nothing. Set ID. Where are we calling this? Let's check the debug again. Okay, so we're doing something wrong now. Okay, the thing that we are doing wrong is that we are adding the first element without the ID here, but then when we set the messages, we are referencing the ID here. So we have to, in fact, do this. Where do we have these brackets? So this should be session chat ID is that. So now it should work, but we have to again delete our session because it is invalid. And then if we go here and we say hello, then we get a message and we get a title. And if we refresh and we go here, we have the chat here. So now it works. And we can continue this. Tell me a joke. And here we have a joke. And if we create a new chat and I will say, write an article about PHP. And here we go. We are writing an article about PHP. And it is working perfectly. And this will be saved into the sessions after it's done. And here we have the power of PHP. And we can switch between chats. And if we refresh, we still have everything here. So now it works. Now we can save to the session storage again. But now we have to change in the actual code which one we want to use. So how about we do this? Let's create a function that gets which class we should use. So let's say that the conversation class is get conversation class. And then we're going to do this. We are going to use that conversation class instead of the hard-coded class. And let's now find every place where we are using that. And we are going to add this thing in here. And we are going to say that this will be the conversation class. And down here as well, conversation class. And let's do that. And here, conversation class. And let's add it here. And that is it. Then let's put that function somewhere. Let's put it to database because I don't know where else to put it right now. So I'll make a function get conversation class. And let's here get the settings, require settings.php. And let's do this. Return settings. Let's call this storage class. Maybe I should have called this storage class. I'm not sure what is a good name for this, but we'll do this. And then what we can do is we can go to the settings and we can add here storage class. Now it's kind of funny that it's storage class. I will just call it DB type or storage type. And it can be either session or database, let's say. So then we can do something like this. Return storage class or conversation class with the storage type. And let's set here conversation class equals an array with session being a session conversation class or DB being SQL conversation class. Or in fact, I will call it SQL. So now, if we refresh this, it still works the same. But if I go to my settings and I call it SQL and I refresh, then now we are using the SQL storage. So now I can easily change between these. And then I can set the session to be the default version. So when you just pull the repository and you add your API key, then it will just work directly. And then you can change it to a database if you want. Now there's one problem with this, which is that now when I change something in the SQL conversation, if I want to add something, so if I want to like add some get type function or something, if we implement something new, I have to create it in both of these. Now, some of the functionality is shared, so we could use some base class, but also we could create an interface. So let's do that. Now, if you're not familiar with interfaces, they're kind of like classes, but they're more like descriptions of classes. So if we create a ConversationInterface.php, and let's create that here. Interface, ConversationInterface. So in an interface, you only define the function signatures of the class that will implement this interface. So we can copy all of these things and we can put them into the interface. Now, interfaces don't actually have any code in the methods. So we only define what they should return. So we have to remove all of this stuff. So we only define that these are the functions, the methods that a conversation class needs to have. And then what we can do is we can go to our session conversation and we can say this implements the conversation interface. And we do the same thing in our SQL conversation. And we have to, of course, include this conversation interface in all the files. Now we should use some autoloading, but I will not do it in this video. And we actually got our first error here. And the problem here is that this one requires the database. So what I will do here is I will, in fact, make this just a regular function. And I will not pass this in. And I will say this database. And I will do the same thing here. I will not pass in the database here, and I will say this database. And I will pass this as this database, and I will pass it here as well as this database. And I will update my interface to be just a public function. And the cool thing about this is now we get an error in our session conversation because we updated our conversation interface. So now we know that this is not compatible with the interface we have created. So we have to change this as well to be just public function, and this will be public function. And then we have to find all of the find functions. And then I'll change this to actually calling it this way. And I will change here to calling it this way. And I will change this to calling it that way, and the same thing in the message. And we should have one more place, which will be the get chats. So this will be conversation class get chats. Now we get this error here because we are returning a string from that function. So we have to update this one. So instead of returning the class, we will return new of that class. So this should now work. If we go to the index, we should not have any errors here. Yes, now it works. And now for the coolest part. So if we go in here to, let's say, the session conversation, and we add a new method here, like public function get type or whatever, then we don't get any errors anywhere. But if we then use this, let's say in the index, we say type equals chat get type. Now we don't get any errors here. But when we go to our get conversation class function, we can type hint this as a conversation interface. So now if we go here, we get an error because get type is not in the interface. So now if we start to add some new functionality to this program and we just update the session conversation, then it will tell us, our IDE will tell us. It will tell us that you have to implement this in the actual interface. And once you do that, then you will get the error to implement that in all of the classes that implement that interface. So this is the great thing about interfaces. So now, if I remove this extra bit here, then I guess it should work now. So we have one more error here. This guy here is red. So this should be get find. This should be find. Okay, now it should work. So let's go back here and let's refresh. And we get an error because we didn't require this everywhere. So I have to say require conversation interface. Now, I should use autoloading here, but I will do that in a later video. So let's check all the places. So we add it there, and we add it here, and here. And let's try this out. We still get an error. Perhaps I have to require it before these other ones. So in fact, I will make an autoloader. I don't want to deal with these things. I will call autoload.php, and I will add that everywhere. So let's create autoload code php/autoload.php. And here we will just do SPL register autoload and function with the class, and we will do require dir/src/class.php. That is all we need, I think. So if we refresh, and now it works, and now we are auto-loading. We don't have to require everything. So if we go here, we still have this conversation. If we go here, we have this conversation. If we get a new one and we say hello, it still works. And if we go to our settings and we change this to SQL and we refresh, did I call it SQL or something else? Too few arguments to SQL conversation construct. We have to pass in the database. So I will pass it in here, database. And I will pass it in here as well, database. Because it shouldn't matter if we pass extra arguments to the session conversation. So that should work. And if we go to get conversation class, so I will add everywhere database. So now it should work. If we refresh, now we have the SQL version and we can open all of these and it works. And let me just verify that it in fact works with the session version. So if I refresh, here we have everything and it works. And that is it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, please leave me a like and subscribe to my channel if you want to see videos like this in the future. And leave me a comment. What did you think of this video? And what should I do next with this project? So thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.